In my video on Freud's model of the human mind, I said that his theory of ego makes no sense. Well, it continues to make no sense, and I'm fairly sure that it never will. Don't get me wrong, I'm not doubting the existence of the ego. I'm doubting of the value of Freud's idea of it. He defined it as coherent organization of mental processes. The human mind is anything but coherent, and neither is the ego. People wouldn't have inner conflicts every other Tuesday if it was. What is the ego then? As it so happens, I've stumbled on just the right case to show what the ego should mean. Cases, as we're about to explore, were common during the time of Freud, and no doubt inspired the creation of the idea of the ego, and it will no doubt help you see what ego is all about. Anne was 5 feet tall, timid, but cultivated 29-year-old woman, fifth child of a wealthy family of 6. She worked as a saleswoman, and she was good at her job. Introverted and slightly depressed would be the best way to describe the impression she would give off to a stranger. To our knowledge, Anne led a fairly average life without tragic events. That is, until her father committed suicide while she was in her early 20s. The death of her father was devastating. She stopped going out and could barely walk. That's when Isabel came into her life. Isabel was a Spanish woman, a singer by trade. She was the opposite of Anne. She was self-assured, articulated, energetic, well-mannered, more dignified and serious than Anne. Isabel gets Anne out of her comfortable shell. She gets her involved in social events. She got her to sing. And she even got her into a love affair. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we continue with the story, there's one thing that I should mention. Anne and Isabel is the same person. Anne was a patient of Charles E. Corey, an associate professor of philosophy from the University of Washington back in 1916. In his report, A Divided Self, he called his subjects A and B. I substituted Anne for A and Isabel for B. Anne had a dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder, and even further back, multiple ego disorder. Isabel was a dissociated part of Anne's mind. What makes the case of Anne special is the aspect of mutual awareness. Usually the original personality isn't fully aware of the newcomer, but Anne is perfectly aware of Isabel, and Isabel is just as aware of Anne. It's quite clear that the death of Anne's father was the direct cause of the emergence of Isabel. The timing, the psychological effect it had on her. She reportedly could hardly walk, and she began to experience hallucinations. Additionally, Isabel stated to Charles that she gained partial control after Anne found out about her father's suicide. There's something that leaves me unsatisfied in the cause of the split of her mind. Of course, the death of her father was the direct cause, but there's many women at her age that have lost their fathers, but almost none of them lose control to a different part of themselves. Why is Anne any different? Charles treated Anne for 3 years, and in this period he inquired into Anne's childhood and life up to the point of division. Charles found out multiple precursors to Anne's mental instability. She had moods of extreme vanity and inexplicable bits of conduct, such as without intention getting out of bed and going through weird dances. Admittedly, that's a little weird, but getting mood swings and impulsive action is a far way away of losing control over your own body and instead being driven by a different person. There has to be something more significant. The missing link might be her relationship with sex. Anne was a part of a covenant. It's not stated when she became a part of one, but she was in one when her father killed himself. In the covenant and at home, her at that time highly sexual nature was repressed. Repressed so much so that she didn't even see herself as a sexual creature. If I had to explain why a part of Anne dissociated, then I would put her open personality as a risk factor. The death of her father as the final drop in the bucket, but the extreme sexual repression as the primary cause of Anne's split. The funny thing about repression is that the more you repress something, the more force it gathers. As Carl Gustav Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Only in this case, Anne calls her Isabel. Anne remembers the exact moment she became aware of Isabel, and she described it as follows. One evening while alone in the house, I was seated at the piano, and it seemed like something said to me, "Take a deep breath," and a sound of singing came from me that I had never heard before, and it frightened me. Just before the song I shuddered as if something had possession of me. I went to the kitchen to get a drink then, and I asked mentally who that was that sang, and I got the name, Isabel. It took few weeks more for Isabel, as she puts it, to get completely out. Isabel herself believes that she's a reincarnated spirit that lived and died long time ago. When I described Isabel, I stated that she's Spanish and a singer by trade. I described her self-image. In the land of reality, things are different. She's definitely not a reincarnated spirit, nor a Spanish woman, nor she's a singer by trade. If Isabel truly was a reincarnated spirit, then it would be easy to gather details that only the dead spirit would know, and then check whether it fits the facts. Nothing of the sort was provided. She likes dishes that she considers to be Spanish, even if they aren't in reality. She doesn't really speak Spanish. She speaks Spanish-ish language. Here's a piece written by Isabel. Obviously, a reincarnated Spanish woman would speak fluent Spanish. The source of Isabel's Spanish was probably obtained through unconscious learning from some of Anne's classmates, which were from Mexico and spoke Spanish to each other. Isabel's self-proclaimed Spanish descent is a mental construct. She's not a singer by trade either. She just likes to sing. There's a common thread that goes through all of Isabel's character: sexuality. Her self-description doesn't seem to make sense, unless you look at Isabel mythologically. If we start with the assumption that Isabel is representative of Anne's spirit of sexuality, then her self-proclaimed reincarnation begins to make sense. The spirit of female sexuality is a spirit that is reborn in every woman. In that sense, she's a reincarnated spirit. Isabel had to be Spanish because Spanish culture is more sexual than the one in Washington. Once again, her singing nature is picked to make her more sexual. In mythology, women tend to use their song to make men fall in love with them.
I disdain all glittering gold. There is nothing can console me but my jolly sailor bold.
Isabel sees herself as possessing all the feminine charms. Anne states that Isabel thinks of nothing but sex. Charles states the same, albeit in a more cautious manner. Everything in Isabel points to sexuality. It's safe to say that Isabel is Anne's sexuality split from the total self. As all human beings, Anne has a sexual side. What most people don't have is the ability to speak to a personified version of it. What Charles found out by talking to Isabel while Anne was under hypnosis is that she was there, aware below the threshold of action for many years before she came out. She described her existence before the split as looking through a window. She couldn't act, but she could observe the world and make Anne feel a certain way. Wouldn't that be a good way to get Anne into a love affair? Anne met a man, Mr. X, for whom she felt a strange fascination. Her interest in Mr. X was so intense that she developed a relationship with him. Anne led a secluded life. Meeting new people is fairly unusual to her. Creating a relationship with one even more unusual. That new person being a man for whom she has feelings for is straight out of Anne's character, but it isn't out of Isabel's. Mr. X was of Spanish descent and many years her senior, therefore Isabel's type. Charles is sparse on details of this relationship. We don't know how it developed or how it ended, if it did. What we do know is the role Isabel played. She was the source of the desire. Isabel later admitted that the whole affair was her doing. She was the one who was attracted to Mr. X. She made Anne feel strange fascination. The only way Anne could satisfy her feelings was to act them out, which led to an affair. Once Isabel gained control, once she was born as a person, her influence became that much larger. Now she could take complete control, and she often did when Anne was detached. The outcome of Isabel splitting from Anne is Anne becoming pretty much unsexed. Anne has lost her sexual desire, which she very much prefers. Those things aren't as simple. As I noted previously, Isabel's emotional state leaches over to Anne. When it comes to sexual desire, Isabel can make her feel it at her own discretion. Isabel uses her ability to motivate action from Anne, and that direction tends to be in the direction of Isabel's interest, sex. The relationship between Anne and Isabel has developed. It has changed from that of childlike my way or the highway to that of a relationship between grown people where there is a back and forth discussion and the final solution tends to be a compromise. Isabel has made concessions in order to enable Anne to sing. The switch of the driving personality is negotiated. The split has made Anne more stable, since Charles judges her to be less nervous. In general, the relationship between Anne and Isabel has become constructive instead of destructive, as it was before the split. The case of Anne makes one wonder what classifies as a mental disease. Anne's life became better after the split. Before the split, Anne was incapable of mediating between her sexual side and her highly repressive environment. She failed to integrate her sexual side in her total self, and the unintegrated part began an unintegrated existence. The emergence and development of Isabel is what points to the nature of ego. When Isabel came out, her way of acting was that of demanding her desires to come true, just like small children do, just as she acted before she came out. As she aged, she matured and developed an ability to regulate her wishes with the balance of the environment. She developed an ego. Anne and Isabel have the same body, the same ears, eyes, hands, brains, and sensations, but somehow they perceive a different world, with each having different thoughts and feelings. The only logical answer is that there has to be some sort of additional structure which is involved in the judgment of the perceived. Ego is the idea which represents this structure. Ego designates the existence of a character in one's mind, whose role is to mediate between all of the forces within his own mind and the external world. Failure to do so leads to a fragmentation of the self, if repression is your cup of tea. On the other hand, if you indulge too much in your passions, then there can be repercussions from the external world, just as severe as from within. Ego doesn't need to be coherent to achieve this goal. Even more so, if a coherent structure would suffice, then why would you need to involve consciousness into the mix? A coherent structure by definition is an orderly, logical, and aesthetically consistent system. Why wouldn't the Lord make it automatic and unconscious just as your nervous system? Ego is anything but coherent. Freud later in his life redefined ego as a system of functions facing reality, controlling drives, and integrating the three agencies of personality. A definition getting closer to the truth, but still missing the complexity of the problem that ego tries to solve.